Hello everyone. In this week's video we will have a look at the Heatmap node. This is a node that extends the functionality of the standard dashboard nodes. To give you an overview what we will do today, we have the final example here. We have a heat map that is dynamically generated with random values, and if in our settings group we can adjust the rows and column count. So if we increase the rows to 7, we can see that now we have 7 rows. So let's get started. First, we need to install the node. We can do that as usual under the Manage Palette section. Go to Install and search for Heatmap. And then we select the Node-RED Contrib UI Heatmap. Now that we have installed it, we should find it under the Dashboard section, and you can see it right here is the heat map. So we drag one in, and let's first go to the help so we can read some things about it. So one thing that I found really helpful is this README page. This links us to the GitHub repository that is the source of this node, and here you can read all the important things about it. So if you use this node, I highly recommend giving it a look here. So if we double click on it, we can see that we have the normal dashboard settings. We can select the grids. We can say if we want grid values or not. Legend, some background settings, and some other settings as well. I will explain all of them in a bit, but first let's do a simple example. So we will need a standard dashboard. Let's just call it dashboard. The group will be heatmap. Okay. Now we can select that one. We want to start. We will need 2 rows and 2 columns. Then as grid values, we would like to have the values rounded to 0 decimal places. Then the legend is also values, and we will leave the background and snapshot and the other settings for later. So to interact with the heat map, you just have to send it a simple array, and it will split this array up based on the column and row settings. So we will just use a simple function node here. We will call that generate data. And for now, we will just return a fixed length array. So let's say msg.payload is equal to an array. And we'll just use the values 1 through 4. Okay, so we can deploy that. We inject, and now we can go to the dashboard and have a look. Now you can see that we have some values here. The small black values in here are the actual values of our points, and we can see them because we selected the grid values as values. And those beneath here are the legends. But as we can see, the thing is way too small for now. So we can go to the dashboard settings again and adjust our layout. Let's do like 8 by 8 for now. We will deploy again. Now we can see that it is a bit clearer to read. So let's play around with some settings here. So next, let's set a fixed color as the background. So here we will just use a simple red as our background. Now you can see that the entire background is red. What you can also do here is selecting a picture or an image. This is what is described in the GitHub repository under this example here. So this image feature would be helpful if you want to display your heat map on top of an actual image, for example, an image of a room or whatever. But for now, we will just use a transparent background. Now we will see how that looks now. Okay, now we inject again. and we have the same as before. So another interesting thing is the snapshot. Snapshot just takes a screenshot, for if you want, of the heat map and saves it. We can select between never, always and at request. So always will export the image every time new data gets added, and at request will just save the image when you want. So this would be usable for a save image button or something like that. And if we use a debug node here, you can see that we get an image, and as you have seen in the image upload video, we can now save this to a file or save it in a database. Here we will use never. And down here we have some settings that change the circles that we have here. So for example, we can set the radius to 30 and the opacity is okay, and let's say we want the blur to be higher. So this gives it less visible lines between the colors. So as you can see, the gradient from blue to green is way smoother. Okay, so now we will create a small dashboard where we can automatically select the row and column, and it will generate random data for this map. So for this we will use two slider nodes, and we want to place them in a settings group. So we just use a new group here and call it settings. Okay, now let's call that here rows. We just go from 2 to 10 in a step of 1. I would also only like to output on release, and that's it. Now we can copy paste that and call the other one column. Okay, now let's have a look at it. I need to make sure that I place it in the settings. Okay, and now we have those setting sliders here, but they won't change anything for now. Okay, so next we need two change nodes, because if we go to the documentation here, we can see that we can use msg.rows and msg.columns to specify the rows and columns, but in here we only set the payload to the value. So we use a change node here, and we set msg.rows to msg.payload. Same here, but for column, so msg.column. Okay. Now we connect our function. But as you might have noticed, we have a little problem here. That is that we only have values for both data sets when we change both at the same time. So that doesn't make much sense. So first, let's use an inject node here to initialize the sliders with the number 2. So here we will just send a number 2, and we would like to send it after the reload. That's the first thing. And the second thing is that we would like to store this value. So we store the value in the payload to flow.rows and flow.columns respectively. All right. Now we set flow.columns to msg.payload. Okay. So now if we move our sliders, we should have a 5 in the rows and 8 in the column. And as you can see, that is correct. So now we can connect it to our generate data node. First, we can delete that and read in our flow variables. So we use const columns equals flow.get columns. And now if for some reason this data isn't available, which shouldn't really be the case, but just to be safe, we'll just use an over here, and same for the rows. Okay, now we need to initialize an empty heatmap array. So this is just an array that we will fill with the amount of columns times rows with random values between 0 and 10. Okay, so let's define our for loop for that. So we use for loop with an index I equals to 0. Then as long as I is smaller than columns times rows. So that's the amount of fields that we have in our array. We increment the value by 1. And now for every iteration, we push a value to the heatmap array. So this just adds a value to the end. And we use a random value. This gives us a value between 0 and 1. And by multiplying with 10, we get the value between 0 and 10. Now down here, we need to set the payload, the msg.rows and msg.columns. So we will override the entire message object. So it's going to be object. The payload is just the heatmap array. Then the rows is just the rows. And the columns is the columns. Okay. And that should work. And we'll try that out. So if we set the columns to 4, we can see that we have 4 columns. The rows are 5, so we should have 5 rows. So that seems to work. And now if we change one value, we can see that it gets updated and the values are generated. So that's it for this video. I hope you liked it and you could learn something.